the spring of 1829. A discovery made by a tenant farmer working the fields near the Delaware and Maryland border would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. Suddenly, his plow horse sank into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age, and his skull showing clear signs of violence. This was merely the beginning. Over the following weeks, authorities would uncover on this property the bodies of at least 7 people, including 3 children. All were victims of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror throughout the Delmarva Peninsula. Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon had operated what historians now call the reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. Yet this wasn't solely about human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who murdered rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children when they posed a threat to her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed the true number exceeded 20. Before we continue with the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason Dixon line, I want to hear from you. From what state or city are you listening? The reach of Cannon's criminal network extended far beyond her Delaware stronghold, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and let me know where you're hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered. The discovery of those buried remains would ultimately unravel a criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade, protected by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the simple fact that most of its victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society. Uniquely suited for criminal activity was the area where Patty Cannon built her empire of terror. In the early 1800s, the region now known as Reliance sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions: Sussex County in Delaware, and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to literally step across county and state lines to escape pursuing lawmen. The spot was so remote that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. For miles stretched dense forests of pine and oak, broken only by marshy lands and small clearings, where isolated farmsteads dotted the countryside. Winding through the region was the Nanticoke River, providing waterways that could transport captives silently under cover of darkness. Roads were little more than cart paths, and the nearest substantial towns were days away by horseback. For someone seeking to operate outside the law, it was an ideal location. Martha Cannon, called Patty by those who knew her, had arrived in this borderland sometime around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her origins deliberately vague. Some accounts place her birth in Canada with immigration to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property near the state line. Together, they had at least 1 daughter and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable rural life. Jesse Cannon was described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept to himself, working his small farm and raising tobacco and corn like dozens of other settlers in the region. Straddling the Delaware, Maryland border sat the Cannon homestead on a modest plot of land, a detail that would prove crucial to Patty's later criminal activities. The house itself was a simple 2 story structure built in the common style of the period, with thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary home would soon house secret rooms and hidden spaces, designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay something far darker. The early 1800s marked a crucial period in American slavery, when Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808. The demand for human labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a lucrative domestic market. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $100 Salazars in the Deep South. This price surge created powerful incentives for criminals willing to traffic in human misery. An insatiable demand for enslaved labor had been created by the economic transformation of the South. Following the invention of the cotton gin, cotton production was expanding rapidly across the Gulf Coast states, and planters were willing to pay premium prices for workers. The legal ban on importing slaves from Africa meant that the only source of new enslaved people was the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and re-enslavement of free African Americans. Particularly vulnerable to these predators was the Delmarva Peninsula. Following the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed by their owners, either through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Substantial populations of free African Americans who worked as laborers, artisans, and small farmers existed in Maryland and Delaware. These communities, while legally free, lived in constant fear. They had no powerful protectors, limited legal recourse, and their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated by white authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. Precarious at best was the legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s. While they were not enslaved, they possessed few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Patty Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities created opportunities for exploitation. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil recognizes no gender boundaries. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength for her gender. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely reached 5 feet, and she possessed what neighbors described as an intimidating presence. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed. Her husband Jesse died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. Some later claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property. By this time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror. Virtually non-existent in the rural border region was local law enforcement, and what little authority existed was often corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The social dynamics of the region also favored criminal enterprises. Sparse and often transient was the white population, consisting largely of small farmers, laborers, and people seeking to escape their pasts in more settled areas. There was little sense of community cohesion, and neighbors often minded their own business, regardless of what they might suspect about their neighbors' activities. This isolation and indifference would prove crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so many years. With her daughter's marriages began the transformation of Patty Cannon, from frontier widow to criminal mastermind, in a pattern that would define the next 2 decades. Both of the young women's husbands were slave kidnappers. Her first husband, Henry Brayton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brayton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware, for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. Well known in the local community long before his arrest had been Brayton's criminal activities. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. This mobility provided perfect cover for his illegal activities. He would identify potential victims during his legitimate business calls, noting which families had teenage children or young adults who might bring high prices in southern slave markets. Often crude but effective were the methods employed by early kidnappers like Brayton. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life to capture their victims. A common technique involved approaching free African American families with offers of employment in distant locations. Parents desperate for economic opportunities for their children would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had signed their children's death warrants. It was after his escape that the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Brayton, working with Paddy Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigdell at Cannon's tavern. The plan was simple but brutal: get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the witness. Court records show that Rigdell was shot and killed during the robbery. Brayton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Paddy Cannon escaped prosecution. A significant escalation in the criminal activities centered around the Cannon property was marked by the Rigdell murder. Prior to this incident, the family had been involved primarily in facilitating kidnappings and providing safe haven for criminals passing through the region. The willingness to commit murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would characterize all of Cannon's future activities. Disturbing details about the crime are provided by contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rigdell case. The victim had been traveling through the region with a substantial amount of money. Estimates suggest between $3,000 and $5,000 intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He had stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging. Unaware that he had walked into a trap, the conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigdell finally retired to his room, Brayton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting and the sound of a struggle followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigdell was dead. His money was gone and his wagon and horses had disappeared. The body was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become a regular practice of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. Nothing to deter Cannon from her chosen path did the execution of her daughter's first husband do. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Brayton's capture was not that crime didn't pay, but rather that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson wasn't just another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and, most importantly, the capital necessary to expand their operations beyond simple opportunistic crimes. Brought to the partnership was a tavern located precisely on the Delaware, Maryland state line by Johnson. This establishment, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was positioned so strategically that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. Multiple purposes in the expanding criminal enterprise were served by the tavern. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons through the property. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them. A neutral ground where plans could be made and profits divided. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its multiple functions. The main floor appeared completely normal, with a common room for travelers, a bar area, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels that had been specially constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessible through concealed entrances and were designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured that captives wouldn't suffocate during long periods of confinement. Remarkably diverse for its time was the gang that assembled around Cannon and Johnson. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys such as John Purnell, who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. This multi-racial composition was strategic. African American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately raising suspicions, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. Particularly valuable to the organization was John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto. His mixed racial heritage allowed him to move between white and African American communities with relative ease. He maintained multiple identities and could present himself as either a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business, depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability made him an ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact. As the 1820s progressed, dramatically expanded was the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker deeply committed to protecting free African Americans, began tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. The horrifying scale of the operation was revealed by Watson's investigations. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon gang. The victims weren't just random targets. They were often specifically chosen for their vulnerability. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable, as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of labor. A level of organization that went far beyond opportunistic crime was demonstrated by the systematic nature of these kidnappings. The gang maintained detailed intelligence about potential targets, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable to capture. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. From Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman who was kidnapped in 1825, comes one of the most detailed accounts. Her testimony, preserved in court records, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith recalled the constant fear, the inadequate food, and the knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Only her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a lifetime of bondage. Crucial details about the conditions endured by victims of the Cannon Gang are provided by Smith's account. She described being seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers, and transported by wagon to the Delaware, Maryland border. See you in the next video.